Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center's Board of Advisors, I'm pleased that you are able to join us today for this conversation on philanthropy. I'm Jim Ferris, and I'm the director of the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy in the Price School of Public Policy at USC. I think you're in for a really dynamic discussion today. I'm thrilled to welcome Don Randel, president of the Mellon Foundation, to LA, and his wife, Carol. I hear that they've been experiencing LA for a few days now. So we hope you've enjoyed it, and you might have some comments about philanthropy, the arts, higher education, things in that universe here. And in conversation today with Don is LA's own Ken Brecker. Ken is the president of the Library Foundation. In addition to Ken, I want to thank the other people who served on the host committee for today's event, Deborah Mero, Rona Sebastian, and Esther Wachtel. And in addition to Ken and Esther, I want to recognize Center board members who are with us today. Their sort of enthusiasm for our work and their support and wise counsel is invaluable to us. Marvin Schottland, Kathy Hession, Margot O'Connell, I think that's everyone. And of course, all of the things we do at the Center would not be possible without the support of our many generous philanthropic partners. Many are here today throughout the room. So let's give a round of applause and thanks to all of those folks. And I'm going to simply introduce Ken Brecker, who's like a force of energy. I don't even know how to introduce him. I told you earlier that he's the president of the Library Foundation, but he was a Rhodes Scholar. He has a Cornell connection. But I think if you were going to ask him how he likes to be described best, it might be as an anthropologist. And so with that, we'll hear about higher education, philanthropy, the arts, and all other things.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to see our community gathered. I'm also very honored to be speaking with Don Randel, whose work I greatly admire. I'm going to do away with the formal introductions and just jump right in. But I do want to welcome Carol Randel, who's here on my right, who is the full partner in this extraordinary man's career and work and thinking. There was a 2000 press conference, which anyone who was there would remember it. I was not there, but I did hear about it. When it was the first press conference at the University of Chicago. It was being announced that Don Randel had been selected to be the new president and was leaving Cornell. And you, as I have heard, you stood up and said, up until now, I always thought that the Odyssey ended in Ithaca. Your Odyssey absolutely did not end on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. It's gone on to the island of Manhattan and extraordinary work in so many areas. I was at Chicago at the university visiting a couple of weeks ago, and I couldn't, knowing that I'd be speaking with Don, I couldn't help but look at some of your work there. And it's one of those marvelous experiences. I went to the Mansueto Library, where 3.5 million volumes are housed in one beautiful building, which looks like a, Carol described it as a spaceship. It landed at Hyde Park and designed by Helmut Jahn. Extraordinary architecture. I always think you can know the greatness of a college president by the architecture that's built during their tenure. Wonderful building. And the books were being supplied to students and faculty like this. And I said, you must have so many librarians. And they said, no, it's robots, actually. And it was. And they were going deep into the ground, and robotic arms were producing these books within minutes. It was absolutely, I was in the 21st century of libraries, and it was very exciting. I also went to the Logan Performing Arts Center, which I was told in our official tour that opened the week before would not have happened without Don Randel. This incredible center with theaters and places for dance companies and artists and giving life to that part of Chicago. But most exciting of all to me, this is the anthropologist part, the space was being shared with community organizations. These extraordinary artists and extraordinary guests and faculty and also students. But the community organizations of the South Side were also using those spaces for rehearsal and performance. And knowing the history of the University of Chicago, at one point, if I'm correct, they even thought of moving the university because of the problems in the community, in the neighborhood. And Don did so much to change that. I have another tiny thing that I'd like to sort of tell the group about, and that's really, it has to do with something that I just can't get over, and maybe that's where we'll just jump in. You have said certain things about philanthropy, which have, I can't say they've kept me up at night, but they have certainly been on my mind, that wonderful feeling when you go to bed thinking of something and you wake up in the morning and it's still in your head. And I absolutely have thought about these things. You've taken the opportunity in this wonderful, extraordinary role, leading one of the great foundations in this country, the Mellon Foundation, to say things and to write things. In your president's report, your president's letter written every year to the board and to the public, you've said things about philanthropy that have just been different than anyone else, anything I've ever read before. I'll give you a brief quote. This is not the one that kept me up at night. You said impact and assessment don't work, because the most important things in life don't lend themselves to impact and assessment. For example, love. You said, when I hear talk of venture philanthropists and entrepreneurial philanthropists, I think we're a lot more like bookies. With some ability to read the racing forms, we go to the track, and when we spot a good-looking horse, we decide to put $2 on the nose on that one. Now, I love that. Love that. Tell us a little bit more about that. Are we really bookies? What about impact and assessment? What about all that evaluation? What about all those people we're hiring to do our strategic planning and to look at the work we're doing? Are we off on the wrong course?
There's not just one kind of philanthropy, and it depends on what you aim to do with your philanthropy. I'd say the first thing to bear in mind is nobody has any business telling you how you ought to do it, just because they may do it in some different way. Many people come to philanthropy committed to solving a particular problem, and often people who've made a huge amount of money in the world of business have made that money by solving one particular problem, how to make a lot of money doing one thing. And so bring that kind of style to philanthropy and say, well, I want to cure this, or I want to fix that. And as in the business world, if the guy you hired doesn't make his numbers 2 quarters in a row, you take him out and shoot him. So a good example would be, you'd like to reduce the number of children in Africa who die of malaria. Perfectly well known. A family in Africa that has a mosquito net, which costs $10 or something like that, is much less likely to have malaria, so you can make the calculation, and mosquito nets will reduce the number of deaths from malaria by a factor of P. And you can prove that, you can measure the impact, you can assess the outcome. But there are a great many other things for which it's not so easy, or maybe even impossible. It's impossible to assign a number. And at that point, I think we need to remind ourselves that it's not always about the value proposition as defined in the world of business, but it's about the values proposition. As what values do you have and do you want to bring to the world, and what values do you want your resources to support? And many of those things will not be subject to a kind of quantitative measurement. I think that's particularly true in the arts and in education. So I can enable the Los Angeles Philharmonic to give concerts that it might not otherwise be able to give, Can I prove to you something about its contribution to the gross domestic product or to the national defense, or that all the people who heard those concerts turn out to be better citizens and more responsible citizens of the country? Can't prove it, but nevertheless, it's still something that I believe in, makes the world a better place to have great music by the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and so I'm going to support that.
Well, you raised the subject of Los Angeles, and I was going to wait a little bit before doing that, and there really will be time for you to ask questions, but I'm fascinated by your take on Los Angeles. When Don and Carol arrived just a couple of days ago, they put on their raincoats, and off they went to the Getty and to LACMA. They saw the Mapplethorpe albums, and they also went to Disney Hall to see Esa-Pekka Salonen conduct, and they went to 3 movies. One in Spanish, I believe, Hecho en Mexico, as well as Argo and something else, maybe the James Bond, I don't know for sure. They went to Union Station to look at the architecture. They embraced Los Angeles. And this is a room of people who love the city. We love the city. We are committed to it. We are funding it in all of our different ways and supporting institutions and using our whatever power we have to give the sense, to create a deeper sense of the importance of Los Angeles. But we're also very realistic. And we know that there are serious issues, serious problems. And my son said to me recently, because I was sounding a bit like a booster for Los Angeles, he said to me, Dad, if you look at our country, he's 18 years old, he said, if you look at our country, we're 7th in literacy, we're 27th in math, we're 22nd in science, we're 49th in life expectancy, we're 178th in the world in infant mortality, we're number 4 in the labor force, number 4 in exports, and we lead in only 3 categories. I said, okay, what are the 3 categories? And he said, we lead the world in only 3 categories. And Dad, it's the number of incarcerated citizens, it's the number of adults who believe that angels are real, and defense spending. It was a very serious moment at our dinner table. And we were thinking hard about the world that we're bringing this child into. And we think hard about that world in Los Angeles when we look at our population, we look at the needs of the city and the needs of our educational system. And I'm very, very interested in asking you, as someone who's done a tremendous amount of thinking about the nature of our country and the things that are really valuable and worth defending, what you're thinking in terms of where we need to go.
Education, broadly conceived, is hugely important, but it requires us as a country to think about it as a very big system that needs many different kinds of ingredients. We have in this country no national policy about education, really, at any level. The Secretary of Education has a few carrots and almost no sticks. So it's all left to the localities. What we are confronting here is the lives of young people that begin obviously in the cradle and end in adulthood, and different things are needed along the way. I'm often heard to say, we will never figure out how to fix schools in this country if we don't figure out how to fix families. Because by the time a lot of little kids get to school, it's already too late. How do I respond to that in daily life, since the Mellon Foundation supports only higher education? Mm-hmm. Well, I believe that there has to be some place for those kids to arrive after they've gotten to what I hope is a good grade school and a good high school, and that higher education is, in fact, the great engine of this country's prosperity and well-being. If you think about it, higher education is the single most successful business the United States has ever engaged in. It's close to 3% of GDP, which is not far from the automobile business. The markets have spoken. The footprints from around the world have made it clear that we have, or had, it better than anybody, and we are systematically disinvesting in it. So the question I have to ask myself is, how can I devote the resources of this foundation to higher education when there are so many desperately poor kids who need that kind of help? Well, there has to be something for those kids to get to. And ultimately, the country needs an investment at that end of the pipeline, and we have to find the way to invest in the earlier stages of the pipeline while simultaneously investing in the end of the educational pipeline. State of California has what is arguably, or was, the greatest system of public higher education the world has ever known. And it's no accident that the economy of the state of California has flourished the way it has at some periods, because it had this ability to educate people. And to see it being steadily whittled away at, or worse, is a great, great tragedy for the country. And what's required here is a kind of national commitment to education at all levels. But we can't neglect higher education, even though it's very easy for people to say, but the schools, but poor kids. Well, we're trying in higher education to make it accessible to people no matter what their economic circumstances, but somebody has got to attend to higher education while others attend to public schools. Within the world of higher education, we support only the humanities. Well, what's the contribution of the humanities to the gross domestic product or to the national defense? I think there are arguments you could make, those instrumental arguments that say, well, yes, if we knew more about other parts of the world, maybe we wouldn't be so quick to go to war with them, or if we did go to war with them, we'd understand who we were fighting against and for what purpose. And if we knew better other parts of the world, we'd have more allies when we undertake some adventure of the kind. So there are instrumental arguments for that. But it's also that every child comes into the world a born scientist and a born humanist and a born artist. Every one. And the problem is we find a way to beat it out of them if we're not careful. And our responsibility to kids is to keep alive that thing that makes them turn over rocks, that makes them like to hear stories and tell stories, that makes them interested in, at first, scribbling, but then those scribbles get to be more and more interesting. We have to keep that alive throughout a person's life. It doesn't just end with the public schools. And so a responsibility, I think, of the Mellon Foundation and of this society in general is to attend to some of those things that make life worth living. Every person has a capacity for the exercise of their imagination and their creative abilities, and to deny people the opportunity for the exercise of that, no matter how they buy their groceries, is a fundamental denial of a human right. So I think at every level of education, for good and sufficient practical reasons, but as equally for reasons having to do with basic human rights, we have to stimulate the imagination, enable people to learn the kinds of things they learn from reading great literature and studying history. And the country, unfortunately, has made some serious mistakes because it had no memory of history, very deeply ingrained.
I'm going to push you on higher education because I feel like we're so lucky to have Don here. Who are these students? Who are the students of today? I just looked at a report which said the students that started, the freshman that started this past September has never seen a paper airline ticket. They do not listen to the radio. They program their own music. They're not reading newspapers. Their friendships are based on social media. They have a very, very different view of the world than their parents. They can't understand why their parents are emailing them when a text would be sufficient. Why do they have to take all the time to read an email when they could answer it in 3 seconds on a text? What's wrong? What's missing? And I just read an article, many of you may have seen it, or some of you may have seen it, in what I suppose is your paper of record in the New York Times on Sunday, a very interesting piece about why go to college. I don't know if you saw it. Very provocative, and they had a tremendous response to it. You saw it. Tremendous response to it. It was a piece called Say No to College by Alex Williams. And he said that some of the smartest young people who are in college today are leaving early because they're being offered very interesting jobs and because they are terrified of leaving with the burden of student loans. When a young person wakes up and realizes that there's $1 trillion in outstanding student debt and $17 billion tacked on last year alone, and they have this opportunity. Peter Thiel, interesting figure, the co-founder of PayPal, who started a new program now to take kids out of university. He's paying children, I use the word children, under the age of 20, $100,000 a year to bring their wisdom, their expertise into the technological world at that moment in time, and saying that college is really not necessary for them to, and they use Zuckerberg as an example. How do we respond to this?
You ask many questions
Yes.
all at once. There's a book published a year or so ago called Academically Adrift that tells many a terrible tale about a lot of young people in college. They surveyed people from all over the country and students saying that, yes, maybe they study 12 hours a week, and many other equally scandalous findings. The population of young people in college is not homogeneous by any means. They arrive in college with certain kinds of values that they got at home. The interest in certain kinds of things as opposed to other kinds of things depends a lot on what kind of conversation there was around the dinner table, if any. And so that's, again, in the category of saying we won't figure out how to fix schools if we don't figure out how to fix families, or to make sure that young people have certain kinds of values. And there are many things about our culture of which, let's face it, we can't be proud. Popular culture is extremely interesting to me and to the anthropologist. That doesn't mean it's wholly admirable and that we shouldn't, in fact, lean against certain tides that are sweeping over us. But there are also lots of talented young people in certain kinds of institutions where the life of the mind, let's call it, is what's valued and which constitutes a vast and crucial resource for the nation. Now about the cost of it. Well, it turns out, there's a recent book called Why Does College Cost So Much? It turns out that the cost of higher education has risen at exactly the same rate as dentistry. I mean, exactly. You look at the graph, and these lines lie right on top of one another. The cost of legal services has gone up somewhat faster. We don't hear calls in Congress for the outrageous rate at which dentistry is going up, let alone how fast lawyers' fees are going up. It's about higher education. Why should it cost so bloody much? Well, I think the dentistry case is an interesting comparison. Why does dentistry cost so much, or why does the cost go up at the rate it does? It's because when you get right down to it, there is a limit to how many mouths a dentist can put his fingers in one day. And if your business is putting your fingers in the minds of young people in a way that will make a difference, there's a limit to how many of those you can do in one day. Productivity gains are not easily achieved in the best kind of education. The main cost there is people costs. It's not unrelated to the problem in public schools. We like to complain about the teachers, but we don't want to pay them anything or give them much respect. If I were running the university and I wanted to ensure that the cost of higher education wouldn't go up faster than the rate of inflation, say, I could recruit a young assistant professor and say, we're so happy to have you working at this university. I can assure you that you're going to have a wonderful career here, and that when you retire 30 years from now, you'll be making in real terms exactly what you're making today. There's no business in America that could flourish or survive if that's the way it treated its employees. But the complaint about the rising cost of higher education is an insistence that that's how higher education ought to behave. We ought to get really talented people and tell them, you're going to retire making exactly what you make today. Technology is sometimes said to be the solution to all of this, and so you've all read about massively open online courses. My other motto, one of my other little mottos, is technology never saved anybody a nickel. Computers have enabled us to do many things we never dreamed of wanting to do, and to do many things better, but they haven't saved us anything, and certainly not in higher education. They just enable us to do more stuff that we didn't know we wanted to do in the first place. And when it comes right down to it, what is it that you want out of your education? If you reflect on your own education, I hope it's the case that you remember some individuals who had a transforming effect. I wager that you don't remember so much of what exactly they taught you. You couldn't make the list of facts that you got from this or that person, but this or that person somehow affected the way you thought about things, the way you go about the world, the kind of questions you ask. Well, it's that turn of mind that we look to cultivate, and that's really only achieved when you've got somebody sitting across the table from you who looks at your written work and says, there's no real argument here, you know? What's the argument? Where are the sinews of the thinking behind this piece of work? And that's something that has to be done in the main, one person with one person over a period of time. Sure, there are plenty of things you can teach faster and maybe even better with the aid of technology, and certainly technology can enhance many things. But technology will not bend the cost curve of higher education except at certain levels. Technology will not enable this country to produce creative, imaginative people who will solve problems we don't yet know we're going to have, or who will create businesses that we don't yet know we need to have.
Your own, excuse me, your own scholarship, your own work, sitting at that table, listening to that music, Don's work as a musicologist in medieval Andalusia and on Latin American song and in France and Spain, and inspires me to ask a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while. I once heard Wynton Marsalis talk about jazz, and he said that jazz, improvisational jazz, for him was the best way to understand democracy, because you had to know when to come in, you had to listen hard to who came before you, you had to build on the riff that was just before you, you had to play well with the group, but you also had to be willing to go solo. He went on in this beautiful way talking about it. The important question for me, the question that I've been wanting to ask you, is about your own work in music and whether it's informed the way in which you live your life and do your professional work. You're the editor of the Harvard Dictionary of Music. You've taught the legendary Introduction to Music 105, was it? 105 course for years. But is there something in your years and profound writing about the history of music and music that actually, in your world, has informed the way you work and the way you think about philanthropy?
I have many lame analogies and metaphors, so I couldn't tell you how many times I was asked, how is it that a musician becomes the president of a university? Well, so I say things like, well, every musician, first thing you learn is how to count. And I go on to how you bring consonants out of dissonance.
I like that.
So forth.
That's a good one.
But in the end, I guess I would have to say, all of that sort of thing aside, music has been, for me as an academic, a kind of platform for doing certain things to reach other people. And I could have done that from any number of other platforms. When I was in college, I right away decided I I wanted to be an academic. I didn't know about such things before I got to college, but it only took about 6 weeks to figure out that the faculty was on to something really good. And so I wanted to major in every subject that I studied for the first 2 years, and finally got down to Spanish literature, because I'm a native speaker of Spanish, having grown up in Latin America, or music. So I could have done many of the same kinds of things being a student of Spanish literature that I do in music. I love both of those subjects. They would have been the way in which I engaged young people and try to help them think better, write better, be more open-minded, more imaginative. I could have, from that platform, tried to reach broader audiences. Part of my reason for undertaking the Harvard Dictionary of Music was as a way of trying to bring to bear the best scholarship for a much bigger audience, to enable people for whom music is a minor avocation, perhaps, give them a book where they could look stuff up and get more or less a good answer. When it comes then to getting into academic administration, it's a remarkable thing. Universities do essentially nothing about succession planning. Every university president, or most of them, started out as an assistant professor of something. And yet no assistant professor was ever hired with a view to whether he or she might become the president, let alone, or even the department chair or something like that. We just march the institution up to a cliff every 10 years and hope we get lucky. So caring about the values of such things, I always said, well, if there have to be presidents and provosts and deans, I want them to have my values. And those were the values of trying to reach people, trying to help young people learn about the life of the mind, that the thrill of new ideas is still the greatest thrill you're ever going to have in all your life, next to falling in love. And to make it clear that there is something, many very important things worth living for that don't necessarily come up in daily life, in how you earn your living.
I want to ask you about ambiguity and failure. And this may seem an odd question to ask such a successful, extraordinarily successful man in everything he's done. But you've written a lot about it. You've thought about it a lot. And one of the lines that I remembered, I copied it out into my journal, and you said, we only support money-losing businesses. The worst thing about much of philanthropy is that the foundation world is fickle. And you went on to say that philanthropy must, in the end, be about the values worthy of the name. And these are not easily measurable or rankable. We must begin by asking not what is the problem to be solved, but what is the phenomenon to be addressed, and what are the values to be realized. And I think that's really a description of the work that you've done. But I worry that in our individual, as we define our individual roles in philanthropy, and there are people in this room who have been extraordinarily generous and effective and brought about change and created opportunities, that sometimes we're very worried about failure. We're very worried about being perceived as having failed. And we're very worried about ambiguity. We want the clarity.
Well, one of the things one hears most often in the world of philanthropy is, it's so much harder to give away money than it is to make it or spend it. Yes and no. To put the matter in the most outrageous of terms, philanthropy is just like sex. If you worry about it too much, it won't work, and it probably won't be any fun either. It's, as in life, what it comes down to is trying to figure out who you can trust and then actually trusting them. The Mellon Foundation has a quite different style from most, and you should understand you're hearing from somebody who is a sort of radical in this business. We work with a limited number of institutions that we try to get to know extremely well over long periods. We want desperately not to be the kind of organization that gives you $1 million to do something that you never knew you wanted to do, and then 3 years later goes away and says, now you pay for it. Institutions of higher education and cultural institutions are under extraordinary pressure to contain costs, to stick to their mission, not get into businesses they don't belong to, and yet foundations are often hard at work getting them to do just the opposite. So, yes, we support only money-losing businesses. So when you hear people say, well, I won't pay for a deficit, every nickel that comes through the door is helping to pay for a deficit. It's just a question of which the first nickel is and which the last nickel is. So every one of these institutions starts in with a deficit. And you're trying to fill that hole from day one, and you get down to the end, and you hope you arrive at the right place at the right time. So yes, we support only money-losing businesses, and I'm not embarrassed to say that. But we support the money-losing businesses of people that we hope we can trust, who've done good work over time, and we trust them to keep doing good work with our help. How do we know whether that's succeeding or not? Well, we go to the plays, the dance concerts, the philharmonic concerts of the people we support, and we keep up with how they seem to be doing, but not something that you measure. In higher education, we believe that the humanities need to be supported in the national interest and in the interest of every one of these individuals. So we find institutions that seem to share that value and have a commitment to the humanities and are going to stick to it and not fire half the English department and hire more professors of undergraduate business or something of the sort. It's a question about who you can trust, whose values you share, and then put $2 on the nose of that one and let them run. And
Good advice.
if, in fact, they don't sometimes lose, you're probably not trying quite hard enough. That is to say, if some number of the horses you bet on don't once in a while come in last, doesn't mean that you've done the wrong thing. It's a question about instinct, but ultimately, as in so many things in life, it's who can you trust?
There's a wonderful line in Bertolt Brecht's diaries where he asks the question, I wonder what they did the night after they finished building the Great Wall of China. And I want to ask Don that question. On March 15th at 1:30 p.m., because of a forced retirement, the mandatory age requirement of the Mellon Foundation, you will be out of the harness. You'll be a free man. I'm fascinated to know, having built the Great Wall of China, what you're thinking about, what you're going to be reading, what you're doing next, what's got your intellectual curiosity, and what you want to write.
Well, I'm curious about too many things is probably something of a problem. So I expect to indulge interests in lots of things that I haven't been able to do before. One of the things that's not, I think, well understood about higher education when we speak about woolly-headed professors and so forth, it's ruthlessly competitive. If you're a professor choosing a field at random of music history at a pretty good university, your whole training and your whole goal in life is to get to be the best person there is in that field. That everybody will know, by golly, Randel is the guy you have to go to if you want to know about this or that. So you spend your life in that way, and if you're not careful, it forces many things out on the periphery, which is not a good thing. But now I get to indulge my interest in a lot of things in which, I'm never going to be the great authority. I'm going to read books about fields to which I will never make an original contribution, but boy, is that going to be fun to learn from other people who are the great geniuses in those fields. And simultaneously, I'm back already. Once I saw the whites of my successor's eyes, who was named a few months ago, I began to be able to make time for myself, and so I'm back to writing about music. And it is absolutely thrilling, because although I've written a lot as a university and foundation professor and president about various things. You know, to sit down and spend a few hours thinking hard about and writing about some very small, very beautiful thing, like a Schumann song, say, is thrilling. And you don't really know what you think about such a thing, even though you may have thought about it for years and have it deeply embedded in you somehow. You don't really know what you think about this until you have forced yourself to put words on the page. One of the things that is often not understood about writing is that it is not taking dictation from your brain that's got it all figured out. Writing is a tool of thinking, and it's when you make yourself write about something that you are forced to think about it in ways that are not otherwise achievable. That's when you find out what you're really capable of thinking, when you're forced to write about it. And there's no thrill like it, I must say. Imagine if you were in college for 4 years and that's all anybody wanted you to do was think hard and write about stuff. I mean, what a life. It'd be certainly worth $50,000 a year.
I hope I'm not revealing a secret here, although my wife says that my idea of keeping a secret is telling one person at a time. But I did hear on the street in New York, or maybe it was in the corridor of the Mellon Foundation, that I heard a name spoken in relationship to your future, and the name was Cole Porter. Is this true?
That's true. I actually wrote an article about some songs of Cole Porter last summer. I mean, that's 500 years from anything I'm taught to know about. But it turns out that thinking hard about things does yield results. Another thing I'll say in relation to that, we often talk about in research universities how the faculty is only interested in its research and not interested in teaching, and this is a terrible thing. For me, and I think for many of my colleagues, research and teaching are absolutely of a piece. I would say that the best ideas I've ever had as a scholar, including the things I'm working on now about Schumann and Cole Porter, but articles that I wrote a long time ago that people still read and argue about and think are possibly important. Those ideas, every one, I would say, of my best ideas came to me preparing an undergraduate class. Because freshmen don't know enough not to ask hard questions, if they're bright the way you hope they are. And I'd be reading the scholarly literature on this or that subject, and I'd say, man, nobody who hasn't already been socialized to the discipline is going to believe this stuff, This is, some literally, so often what we read about many fields, is still the legacy of the 19th century German university, where knowledge was carved up into these disciplines and never should the twain meet and so forth. So yes, preparing to teach intelligent people who haven't yet been to graduate school is really challenging to your thinking.
I feel I've got to open this up, and we'll take a few questions. Who would like to begin? Yes, please introduce yourself if you would. And there's a microphone coming right toward you. Here.
Carl Noyce from Orange County, also a Cornell grad and involved with the university back east now. But you mentioned several times families and values as being issues, and I think you seem to indicate that the problem with education maybe has a lot to do with what's going on in families as opposed to what's going on in the classroom. So, and you referred to fixing families. So what's broken in families and how did it get that way in America?
I have some simple ideas about what the remedies would be or what ought to go on there, and naturally they're derived from life. My parents had no higher education, but I went to school from day one knowing that going to school was something important and neat to do, and you ought to do what the teacher told you to do, and it was simple as that. The talk around the dinner table was about books, and I was read to and sung to from long before I could either read or sing myself. I used to think at Cornell, a little town of 30,000 people with a black ghetto, only 6 or 8 square blocks. Kids in that neighborhood dropping out of school at the same rate they dropped out of school in the Bronx. I thought, man, I've got 10,000 able-bodied undergraduates here. I'm going to send undergraduates down there just to read to these kids, you know, pick them up from the hospital and start reading to them right then. I mean, I think simple things like that would do a lot. Preschool is incredibly important because we won't be able to fix the family in the sense that we will not immediately be able to provide every baby with 2 loving parents who are, or even one maybe, who's going to read to them. But preschool is extremely important, and being read to, that simple fact of being held and read to is the essential preparation for life, I'm sure of it.
What are your thoughts on dealing with the rising student debt and the default rate on the debt? This just can't keep going on the way it is.
That is also a much more complicated matter than you might judge from reading scary numbers about its total volume. For a start, you would have to take account of what's going on in the for-profit sector. So a huge amount of the college debt and a huge fraction of the default rate in the college debt is in the for-profit sector. The for-profit sector is not all bad. I don't mean to suggest that. But there are some rapacious institutions out there who gain all of their income from federal funds, essentially. The law is actually, you're not allowed to derive more than 92%, I think it is, of your income in a for-profit from federal funds. And so institutions hit that limit, and how do they solve the problem? They raise tuition higher, so it's no longer 92%, and send these kids into bigger debt than ever. So if you want to understand college debt, you do have to take account of some really despicable practices in the private sector. The way some institutions prey on veterans in just the way used car dealers prey on veterans. You go to any base in America, you know, and there's a long line of used car dealers outside the front gate and selling cars to GIs that are dangerous in some cases. Well, private sector has gone after that same kind of business because the rules are much more generous for veterans, and so a lot of money is being made off of it and no value produced. Now, to put the matter absolutely baldly, if we get the cost of higher education, let's say we can get it under some control without my conceding that it's out of control, because as I say, it inexorably goes up faster than the CPI. It more or less has to, like any people-intensive business. But let's say we can get that where it needs to be, and it goes up at some reasonable rate. If at that point the problem about access to higher education is money, that is, many people, half the country, now you have to remember, half the country is living on $40,000 to $50,000 a year or less. Half of the country. And college costs $40,000 or $50,000 all in at a really good private place. If the problem of access to higher education is money, then as a society, if you believe in the importance of it, you have to take the money from people and businesses who have it and give it to those who don't. That's income redistribution, right? Now, since we have no national policy about this, we only barely address education by means of income redistribution. We leave the 4,000 institutions of higher education in the country to do it on their own. And so you have every last private institution, and now increasing numbers of publics doing their own kind of income redistribution. Why do some places charge $50,000 a year? Well, it's so they can give about half of that, or in some cases more, to people who can't afford anything. So the discount rate, so-called, on tuition in many institutions, including household names, is 50% or more, and that is simply in order to enable access for the people who can't afford it. So there are two ways in higher education to do income redistribution. You could do it through the tax code, but since we're allergic to that, you make institutions do it willy-nilly, and it produces this chaos of institutions, each trying to do its own way. You think that's a problem only with private higher education. It is equally the problem of public higher education. So, many states, in-state tuition is held down. State legislature cuts the budget. So the challenge is the only alternative is to increase tuition even for the in-state kids, but you're keeping that probably at half what it costs. And you compensate by taking kids from out of state. And so if you go to Berkeley or the University of Michigan, it costs almost exactly what it costs to go to Harvard if you're from out of state. And Berkeley is every year dialing up the percentage of kids from out of state, not anywhere near as far along as Michigan, where over a third of the students at the University of Michigan come from out of state and are charged Harvard-style tuition. It's as if the solution to the funding of public higher education in America would be for every state institution to take students only from other states.
Carla Christopherson, not a Cornelian. What's your view on community colleges and on whether they provide an appropriate or needed entree, or whether it takes away from sort of a broad education that you get from being someplace for 4 years with the best and the brightest of the teachers?
I think the community colleges and two-year institutions of many kinds are absolutely crucial to the system as a whole. And you will hope, I will hope, that even in those two-year schools, there is some element of what we would call liberal education that is not only about learning a trade, but after all, we will need construction workers and welders in this country, and they need to be trained, and many of them, certainly at that age, are not temperamentally inclined, maybe not with the right kinds of talents to go on to certain other kinds of institutions. It should be possible for anybody who does well in community college and has the talent and the inclination to go on to other kinds of institution and increase the level of education they reach. But the community colleges are absolutely essential to us and need to be invested in. And that was one of the great things about California, that you had a system in which there were the several different kinds of institutions, from community colleges to the 4 years, to the state schools, to the great university. And you basically didn't allow mission creep. The state of New York, by contrast, never achieved anything like what California achieved in terms of public higher education, partly because it couldn't prevent mission creep. So every two-year school wanted to then start offering four-year degrees, and every four-year school wanted to then have graduate programs and so forth, and it was a very inefficient way for the thing to work. But we need a system that provides a lot of different kinds of education for people with different needs and different inclinations, and we absolutely need to invest at all of those levels.
Do you see any difference in the giving in the younger generations who are either receiving this great, wealth transfer or making it themselves versus us older folks and all that, in terms of cultural institutions and universities? Do you think that's a problem? Is there a difference and a problem or challenge?
Mm-hmm. Well, much is said about this, there continue to be, fortunately, very generous people, and some of them very young, and I think it remains to be seen what will happen among a group of people who have created astonishing wealth in relatively recent years, and will they replace the Andrew W. Mellons and the Carnegies and the Fords, though they could well afford to do so. The ones who have begun to distinguish themselves in philanthropy have often been people who go after a certain particular problem and want to fix that. Many of these people, you know, have grown up in generations in which the arts had already been eliminated from public schools. And so when you ask about the audience at the Philharmonic or the opera or the theater, it is a problem that a lot of young adults these days didn't grow up with it and weren't socialized to the notion of supporting these institutions. That may be a problem. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people are quite nervous about it. Whether, let's say, in this country, private philanthropy is still what makes the difference. Corporate philanthropy has steadily declined. Corporate support of basic science has steadily declined. So it's really going to be up to the individuals. Government support is declining for all of these things. So we really need to find out whether young people who've made a lot of money are going to support the kinds of institutions we're talking about here. And I think the evidence isn't all in.
Eileen Adams, in your philanthropy, what kind of thought and philanthropic partners do you look for to perhaps increase the impact of what you're doing and supporting?
Unfortunately, we have the businesses we support to ourselves. Ford, Rockefeller, the other people of comparable size, bigger and slightly smaller, have almost all abandoned support for the arts and for the humanities, so there aren't many partners out there for us. We have engaged in some collaborative efforts when we knew of people who were interested. So the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation has supported dance for a long time, jazz, things that we care about. We don't often develop joint projects, but do look to stay in touch with one another and see how we can reinforce one another's activities. Rocco Landesman, who's just now going to step down as the head of the National Endowment for the Arts, did work to convene a group of private philanthropies, including ourselves, to launch an initiative which came to be called Art Place. And that has had, I think, interesting effects. Maybe, what was it, 10 or 12 philanthropies came together and pooled an amount of money, which was then administered to bring arts and art making into underserved communities around the country. I think that's been moderately successful. There again, I'd have to say, we were in danger of studying that thing to death before you get 10 big philanthropies together. And it was like the bookie going to the track, you know. I went to the very first meeting and, well, we need a committee to study this. And I said, wait a minute, isn't this a good idea? I'm in for $2 million. How about you? And how about you? And how about you? And so with only one meeting, we managed to get people to sign up and say, okay, we'll do this. And Rocco is, of course, a great salesman and has gotten...
He spent a lot of time at the track, too, by the way.
Yeah, a lot, right? With his cowboy boots on.
That's right, a famous punter.
Yeah. And very good at doing things with other people's money. So, you know, as I said to him in the early days, the budget of the NEA is so pathetic that if you could get Congress to double it, it still wouldn't make a dent, and you're never going to get Congress to double it. You'd be lucky if Congress lets you have such a thing at all. So you've got to go to other places in the cabinet that have lots of money. Department of Transportation, Housing, Urban Affairs, Defense, you know, where a few $100,000 will hardly be noticed. And he's been sensational at attracting the participation of other branches of government, not necessarily getting a lot of cash out of them. So yes, it can be appropriate at some points, but we're pretty lonely in this business, actually.
Just that statement, I mean, I'm still reeling from it, although I know the truth of it, that Rockefeller and Ford have abandoned the arts and humanities. What a statement about our Thank goodness this isn't true in our community. It's a very
Well,
sad
you know,
thing.
you think about the NEH and the NEA, they have budgets of about $150 million each. That's the cost of one F-22 airplane. And as a fraction of government expenditures, it's absolutely pathetic. So you could say, well, look, eliminate them. What difference would it make? Well, it would make a measurable difference because state humanities councils and arts councils do benefit from those resources. But what a thing to say about the country, that we eliminated the NEA and the NEH. I mean, I'd be embarrassed to show my face in some places.
One more question? Well, I'd like to maybe conclude by saying something about what I've learned from you, if I may. Forgive me. I don't want to embarrass you, but when I, over the years, have read of what you've said about philanthropy and looked at the work that's been done both as a college president and as a provost at Cornell, president of the University of Chicago, and then, of course, in these years at the Mellon Foundation in New York, I guess I was looking for a metaphor and a way to describe it to myself so I'd understand it better. And that's why I asked about ambiguity and failure. And I felt I came up with something just 2 days ago. And again, I think I'm asking you to indulge me, but I decided it was wildflower seeds. And I began to do my own little bit of research, and I discovered that there are available. In fact, I've actually put it together for you. This is a package of wildflower seeds, and there are seeds in there that will grow only if there's excessive rain in the season. There are seeds that will wait 10 years to germinate. They need a long period of drought. There are seeds in there that will grow in the cracks of the sidewalk of New York, will flourish there. And they have the most extraordinary names. We know some of them, but not all of them. The prairie aster, the butterfly weed, the farewell to spring, the California poppy, Indian blanket, miner's candle, the lupine, the blue flax, the Missouri primrose, the California bluebell, the white evening primrose, the scarlet sage, and my favorite of all, the black-eyed Susan. And I offer these to you and to Carol, who's really the gardener in the family, but to say that what I've learned, and I think we've all heard today, is that when we invest our dollars, our philanthropy, we have to be very patient, and some of it will grow, and some of it will take longer than we're here, and some of it won't grow until there's a terrible drought, and we may even see that. But most important of all, we're doing the planting. And I thank you for being here, and it's an honor to be in your presence.
Thank you. Thank you.